most people, right? We're lions here on your show, I know, but too many people are not lions. Too many people are sheep.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Clair.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Lions of Liberty podcast. This is episode number 172, and that means you can find the show notes for today's show over at lionsofliberty.com/172. And if it sounds like I have a little more skip in my step today than usual, not that I don't always have skip in my step, but it's because it's the first show of the new year of 2016. And not only that, but it's the first episode of our brand new 3-day per week format, with the addition of the Felony Friday podcast this coming Friday. So we've got today's show, you've got another show coming on Wednesday, and Felony Friday this coming Friday. Very exciting stuff. Today's show is sponsored by Health Excellence Select. This is an incredibly exciting alternative to the standard corporatist Obamacare insurance that so many of us have become saddled with. Start the new year right by getting a fresh start with your healthcare. To learn more, head over to lionsofliberty.com/health. My guest today is a professor and chair of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He is the creator and editor of a series of books on philosophy and pop culture, including Seinfeld and philosophy, The Simpsons and philosophy, even The Matrix and philosophy. He is most recently the author of The Free Market Existentialist, Capitalism Without Consumerism. I want to welcome in Mr. William Irwin. William, are you ready to roar?
Yeah, I'm ready to roar, Mark.
All right. I love it. I love it.
Call me Bill.
Bill. We'll go with Bill. I like that. That sounds a little less formal.
Yeah.
And we do a less formal show here. We just like to have a good chat. So we'll start our chat by just finding out, I want to learn a little bit more about yourself, how you kind of got to where you are. So Bill, why don't you tell us how you first became interested in the realm of philosophy overall, and how did that lead you to a belief in free markets and individual liberty?
Well, it's a long road, as you might imagine, so I'll give you the short version. I guess I had what you might call an existential crisis as a teenager, wondering what it was all about. What's the meaning of it all? What's the big picture? And philosophy was the natural subject to study in college, to indulge that interest and that passion. And I became interested in existentialism, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and in philosophy more broadly. But I'm a real kind of latecomer to the liberty movement and to politics in general. Basically, I was satisfied with things if I was left alone. And I guess it was not until well into my 30s that I figured out that I really was not being left alone to the degree and the extent that I'd like to be. And so I started looking into some of the connections between the philosophy that I was studying and some political philosophy.
That's a really interesting point, Bill, because a lot of people I'll hear say, well, look, I don't really care about politics. I just kind of want to be left alone. And then you start to realize, especially as you get older, maybe you start to make a little more money, start to try to do things in the world where you start to realize, like, wait a minute, I'm really not being left alone at all. So I can choose to disengage from political discourse if I like, but that's not going to result in me being left alone. The only way you can really be left alone is to be out there advocating to actually be left alone and pointing out the ways in which we're not.
That's it. That's my story.
So, Bill, you mentioned all these philosophers you were reading. So just to kind of get a general idea, can you just name maybe one or two of those philosophers who were most influential, in those early years?
Yeah. So the French philosopher and existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre was a big influence and importance for me, as was the German philosopher and often considered an existentialist Friedrich Nietzsche.
Then how did you eventually, because I know you're also an Ayn Rand fan as well, and I'm curious because a lot of those guys, especially Sartre, are associated with communism because that's the political path that existentialism, I guess, essentially led them to. And yet, you actually have views that come from all sides of this sort of spectrum, I guess, in terms of politics. So how did that all come together for you?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm a little out of the norm, though from what you say, maybe not as much as I might think, in that other people just want to be left alone and didn't realize it. But the typical story of the libertarian, right, is that they read Ayn Rand as a teenager and fall in love. I think I was well into my 30s before I read Ayn Rand. And it's really her fiction more than her straight philosophy that has resonated with me, Atlas Shrugged in particular. And you're right, the sort of proto-existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre was associated with French communism and socialism, which is the complete other end of the political spectrum from Randian objectivism or libertarianism, more broadly speaking. But to me, the two really go together quite well, the philosophy of existentialism and the political philosophy of libertarianism.
Before we get too much into how these two philosophies can intersect, just so my listeners can get more familiar that might not be, that certain about what existentialism actually is. So can you just put out what sort of your view, your definition of existentialism would be?
Yeah, good question. Thanks for asking that, Mark. I'll stay away from textbook type definitions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we want the Bill Irwin special.
Yeah, all right, I'll give you that. So existentialism, as the name might imply, is a philosophy that dwells on what it's like to be an existing individual, as opposed to what it's like to be a member of a group. And so the primary concerns of existentialism tend to be freedom and the responsibility that comes along with that freedom, and the way in which I can use my freedom to create my own individuality and to be a genuine, or what the existentialists would call an authentic person.
So how did that sort of view of existentialism, which you mentioned there, include sort of, the ideas of freedom, personal responsibility? So why did your influence, Jean-Paul Sartre, why did he become a communist? Why did he not sort of see that view of existentialism through to the ideas of individual liberty, as you seemingly have?
Yeah, that's always been a mystery for me. And so that's part of the motivation for the book, The Free Market Existentialist. This is a philosophy, Sartre's philosophy is existentialism, which emphasizes our freedom. And he's really dwelling on our metaphysical freedom, the way in which we have free will, in which we get to make our own decisions, and we're not simply like animals working on instinct, or like rocks falling downward, obeying the law of gravity. But we human beings are special in the sense that we have freedom to choose. And with that comes the responsibility, right? And the short version of the story is that before World War II, Sartre was a lot like the way I described myself, and maybe a lot of your listeners can identify. He just didn't care about politics. That didn't seem to be what was important. What seemed to be important was how, in the course of daily life, one could be an individual and not just kind of get pushed along by social forces. After World War II, the French intellectual set came to be dominated by socialists and communists. And at the risk of simplifying the story, in a way, it's the same old story where a guy falls in with the wrong crowd. There was tremendous peer pressure to conform to socialist and communist ideas. And so we have Sartre's philosophy morphing from one that emphasizes the freedom and responsibility of the individual to one which then shifts to suggesting that our freedom is limited by social and economic circumstances, and that no one would be free until all were free, with free being understood as being some sort of utopia in which nobody was unduly influenced by social or economic structures. So to me, that's where he lost his way. And so part of what I try to do in the book, The Free Market Existentialist, is take the early philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre and apply it to social and political philosophy of libertarianism, which holds us not only free in the political realm, but responsible in the individual realm.
So it seems like what Sartre really had down was the idea of internal freedom and kind of being free in your mind and free to, view the world however you want and things like that. But when it came to political structure, he kind of saw communism as a way to, I guess, make all of man free in some way against the oppression and the injustices that were going along from capitalism or what have you. Was that kind of sum it up?
Yeah, that's a really nice way of recapping.
Oh, good, because I felt like I wasn't sure of that. So I'm glad that you think it was a nice way to put it. Very good. So I just want to delve just a little bit more into existentialism, because honestly, most of what I learned about existentialism is through your book. It's a philosophy I'm vaguely familiar with, but I've never really dived into in great detail. So can you kind of describe, from my understanding, existentialism basically says that the world is meaningless, and because the world is meaningless, we shouldn't spend any time trying to really find meaning. We should just kind of live freely within our own minds and express ourselves in whatever ways we so choose for ourselves, for what benefits us. So well, first of all, can you just tell me if that's remotely accurate, I guess?
Yeah, that is accurate. So I had mentioned my own sort of philosophical awakening being what we sometimes call an existential crisis, right? I had lost the religious faith of my upbringing, and I was asking, well, if I can't look to church or religion for meaning, where can I get it? Is there any? And it's a sort of frightening place to be for any person. And the existentialist view of things, I think, fits very nicely with the concept of spontaneous order, which plays a real role in Austrian economics and a lot of libertarian thinking, rather than look for a kind of a top-down creation, right, as one would from a religious perspective, in thinking that God creates and gives meaning to an individual life. Instead, the idea in existentialism is that, well, while there may not be any of that top-down creation of meaning, that doesn't mean that you can't create your own meaning. And so that's part of what is involved in defining yourself as an individually existing person and assigning the value and purpose to your own life.
There's a really interesting phrase, Bill, that you mentioned in your book several times, and it's the phrase that we are condemned to be free. So can you describe what that means? I found that really intriguing.
Yeah. So that's Sartre's phrase, right? And so he's using it in the existentialist sense, which you nicely captured by pointing out as like being free within your own mind, right? Nobody can tell me how to think or how to conceive of myself and the world. But it's also true in a broader social political sense. Basically, what the phrase means, condemned to be free, is that freedom is a heavy burden that most people, right? We're lions here on your show, I know, but too many people are not lions. Too many people are sheep, right? And they would rather be told what to do and follow along with rules and prescriptions for how they should live. And the existentialist idea is that this heavy burden is actually a gift, right? It's a gift to have this tremendous freedom so that you can define yourself and live according to the values and meaning and purpose that you give. And the point that I try to make in the book, The Free Market Existentialist, is that this idea can and should be extended into the social and political realm so that we don't need the government to be telling us how to live and what rules to follow in nearly the way in which we do.
So basically, it's this idea that, I mean, yeah, you could even make a case that maybe humans in general might be happier if we didn't have so much freedom of thought. If we were all just drones and we're just told what to do and never knew that there was another way to actually think for ourselves, if we never had that knowledge, maybe we would be happy and just go along freely. But when we know we are free and we know we can have this sort of our own internal thought process about everything, we can interpret things the way we like, we can experience the world in whatever way we choose to. When you have that sort of knowledge, which all humans innately do, it's a challenge. It makes life a struggle because we're always having to make decisions for ourselves. We can't just sit back, and although many people end up kind of putting themselves in a situation where they don't think as much for themselves, I think we both see that in our own society.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. I mean, when you look to the life that most people live, they're following orders, following rules for the vast majority of their day. And too many people, when you take that away from them, they don't really even know what to do. Think of the person who has 2 weeks vacation and gets bored, or think of the person who retires and doesn't really know what to do anymore with themselves. Strangely, I see it sometimes with my students who I have to sign off on their course selections for the coming semester. And too many of them come to my office asking me what I think they should take. And I want to kind of rattle them by the throat and say, this is college and it's not high school anymore. And you're free to choose what you want to take. And you should figure out what you want to take. And that's just sort of a microcosm for the way in which too many people live their lives, looking for one authority or another, whether it be religious or governmental or whatever it may be, to tell them what they should do next.
Sure, and it's kind of hard to blame your students for having that attitude because it's the attitude that we're given, all through childhood. When we're in school, we're told, here are the classes you must take. Here are the texts you must take. Here are the books you must read. We're dictated all these things. And even later in life, we're kind of told, you must go to college. You must get a degree. You must take out these loans. And even later in life, in many ways, we're told, you must get married by X age. You must have kids by this age. You must buy a house. There's all these things that are always drilled into our heads about what we must do to be great citizens or great real adults or whatever you want to call it. So it's not surprising that kids show up to you and say, hey, what do we do? What do we learn about?
That's it. I mean, potentially, if you want it this way, all of life can be scripted for you. As you say, you need to go to this college, major in this major, get married by this age, work in this job, vacation in this particular place. And that's all of the kind of thing that Sartre and the existentialists are reacting against. That what you really need to do is define yourself, become your own individual person, your own genuine and authentic person, whatever that may turn out to be, rather than simply living a scripted life.
Bill, another thing that you bring up in your book in terms of kind of coming to these views is the role of human evolution. So how does human evolution, what role does that play in your view of existentialism and free markets?
Yeah, so this is another place where my view is a little bit out of the norm, in addition to trying to bring Sartre and the existentialists into the realm of free markets. I'm trying to harmonize them with evolutionary theory as well, because the reason that this is seen as a little out of the norm is that Sartre claims that there's no human nature at all, that we're completely free to completely define ourselves, a sort of a blank slate approach to human nature. And I'm arguing in the book that that's a bit overstated, that we do have a certain biological evolutionary endowment, but it's, of course, not determining or defining. Our genes have a lot of influence, but not complete control. And in some ways, you can see that as analogous to any kind of social or economic structures we may find ourselves in. Yes, they may exert influence over us, but they don't have complete control. And so we can acknowledge our evolutionary baggage as well as the social baggage that we find ourselves burdened with, and yet fully define ourselves, react to that, and maintain and exert our freedom in response to it. Along those lines, too, I think it's worth pointing out a lot of people may not be fully aware of the extent to which free market thinking was a real influence on Darwin in the development of the theory of evolution. Adam Smith and the idea of the invisible hand and the idea that we can have order without intended design is something that was a major influence in tripping the switch for Darwin to put things together in the biological realm. And that carries over into existentialism as well. Again, we don't need to look for top-down creation. We can have human action without necessarily having design, and we can have order come of that.
Sure. And of course, Darwin's ideas concerning evolution kind of stick a dagger in the idea of sort of a top-down creation of intelligent design to the extent that we should be told how to live and dictate our lives. And that going against that grain sort of ties in right into both existentialism as well as individual liberty. So the connection is actually quite obvious when you lay it out like that.
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, there's a kind of a rebellious streak that runs through all of it, and real nice room in there for individual liberty.
Well, Bill, individual rights is what this show is all about, and we're going to dig a little deeper into the weeds with you on this stuff in just a minute. But first, I have to take a second to tell my listeners a little bit more about today's sponsor, Health Excellence Select. As someone who purchases my own health insurance, I was completely frustrated by my escalating premiums and deductibles after the implementation of Obamacare, and this forced me to seek an alternative. And I found that alternative in the concept of health sharing, where groups of like-minded individuals get together to voluntarily cover each other's medical costs. Health Excellence Select will help you take charge of your healthcare without having to deal with all the cost and hassle of handling paperwork and spending hours on the phone with bureaucrats just trying to get paid. They will handle all the dirty work for you while also providing tons of valuable tools to help you stay healthy. Listeners of this program can get the VIP treatment and get signed up directly by my great representative, Jeff Cantor. Give him a call at 440-283-6849. Tell him Mark from Lions of Liberty sent you. Until then, head on over to lionsofliberty.com/health for more information. Now, Bill, in your book, you quote philosopher Jeremy Bentham, and he believes that natural rights are nothing more than, quote unquote, nonsense upon stilts. And you make it clear that you do not believe there is such a thing as objectively defined rights. Now, I've had people on the show before that believe as you do, believe that all rights are sort of human constructs, and I have other people on that take the sort of objectivist natural rights side of things. So I'm just curious how you sort of, because you do advocate for free markets, which implies a certain level of rights, I guess, in some ways. So how do you, I guess, justify advocating free markets? How would you define free markets in a context where you also at the same time say that, well, there's not an objective way to define rights?
Yeah, it's a difficult task that I set myself in that regard. If one accepts the idea of natural rights, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or in the Lockean sense, a natural right to property.
Why don't we actually stop there for 1 second and just tell me why you, I guess, disagree with that general notion with the Lockean philosophers, people who actually believe there is a natural right to negative rights anyway, to be left alone, to not be attacked, and certain things like that, where you would say there's not really a right in that sense.
Yeah, well, so I find that kind of right to only possibly be rooted in divine command. Now, I realize some Randian objectivists believe that they can construct those rights in some sort of natural basis, in some sort of Aristotelian basis. I'm just not convinced by those arguments. So someone who is a religious believer, a theist, I can plainly see how they can find those rights issuing from the creator, which is the way in which Locke saw them issuing. But in the absence of that, I don't see any kind of basis for natural rights.
And then, okay, so then how, if you have no basis for natural rights, or, something you can actually define as objectively, these are what human beings' rights are, how do you then take that concept and apply it to the idea of free markets, where a lot of people would say, well, I mean, our free markets are based on property rights. Our free markets are based on certain agreed upon rights that we have to have in place in order for markets to actually function as free.
Well, I think the operative phrase, Mark, is the one that you just used there, agreed upon. And so I think we can have contracts even if we don't have natural rights. And so the most basic right I would want to contract for would be the right to property in my own person. And then stemming from that, the fruits of the labor that issues from my person. So I just wouldn't appeal to some kind of natural realm where these rights exist before the contract for them. Basically, people, I would say, would want to contract not to be harmed in exchange for not harming others, and for having a property right in their person and what flows from the labor of their person. But I can conceivably admit that someone might be willing to divest themselves of those rights. And so really all of this comes back to the idea of contract as I see it.
Yeah, I believe in your book, you basically use the idea of prudential decision-making over moral reasoning. Like the reason that people come together and create these institutions, create free markets, create governments to protect their property, it's because it basically makes sense prudently, because if people can do that, well, that ensures that they won't be attacked, and it makes sense in the terms of survival, which ties back into your ideas about evolution, that they form these sort of contracts, form even a minimal state, as I believe you advocate for, as opposed to just doing it because they believe in some sort of moral good or moral right. Is that about correct?
Mark, you've clearly read my book more carefully than I have. But yeah, that's the essence of my argument, that in the absence of an objective moral or natural right, we're left with prudential decision-making, right? In other words, one is going to be inclined to make decisions and take actions that accord with what one sees to be in one's rational best interest. This is not to say that we're at all perfect in doing that. I wish I were, but everybody falls short of that ideal. But nonetheless, everybody's inclined in that way. And really, we can count on that for much of the work that we need to get done in terms of cooperation. And of course, in a world of saints, we wouldn't need any kind of agreements. We wouldn't need any kind of government to protect those agreements or contracts. But none of us are saints in that sense. And so prudentially, it makes sense for us to agree to have some sort of oversight, someone to guarantee and protect us from force, fraud, and theft. And so out of that can naturally grow, as you say, the minimal state.
Would it be fair to say then that you don't believe that there is anything that actually is known as morals? Like that's a total fiction. That's one of the phrases you use in your book is moral fictionalism. Can you kind of describe that phrase and how that might relate to, what most people might think of as morality? Because you might hear, Bill Irwin say, well, I don't believe there's anything as morals. And people at home might think, well, what do you mean? It's not immoral to kill another person. It's not immoral to torture a child. So how do you reconcile the idea of there not being any morals with, what many people would clearly see as immoral acts?
Yeah, good. Thank you for asking that. So the idea that I explore in some depth in the book is that there are evolutionary explanations for why we have the moral feelings and reactions that we do. So anyone who is biologically normal, and this would exclude psychopaths who are not quite the same as we are in terms of their biochemistry, et cetera, is going to have a moral reaction to seeing a child gratuitously slapped or witnessing someone steal from another person or commit some random act of violence. And so the argument goes in the book, getting into some of the evolutionary history behind this, that we evolved in groups of 35 to 150 humans to live in some kind of society together where reciprocity, both in terms of the good, in terms of giving and taking, and also in terms of punishing those who transgress, is something that evolved. And so in order to explain why we have the moral feelings and reactions that we have, we don't have to appeal to a god or a Platonic realm of goodness or virtue or any of that. There is a very basic explanation to it, and it's very much like the explanation for why we enjoy the taste of food that is sweet or fatty, because it packed nutritional value to us and had survival value. Likewise, we approve of certain actions. We have the feeling of moral approval, and we have the feeling of moral disapproval for certain actions because it was something that helped us along in our evolutionary history. And there's probably no getting away from many of those feelings. And most of us really wouldn't want to. I don't want to be like a psychopath who can cause harm to others without having the cringe and the uncomfortable feeling as a result.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it, because, I mean, if we were all psychopaths, none of us had that emotional capacity to be horrified by certain things, then our race wouldn't last very long, because we wouldn't be protecting each other. We would just be, I guess, killing each other and cheating on each other and lying to each other. And some people do that, but those people do not make up the majority of the world. And if it did, the human race probably wouldn't last very long. So it's definitely an interesting way to look at it. I mean, would you say that if we see some horrible event, let's say the Paris attacks, and we are all horrified when we see this, we see that people are shot up at concerts, we see that there are suicide bombers. These are all acts that, as human beings, absolutely horrify us. You would say that doesn't come from some sort of internal actual morality. It comes from the evolutionary effect of, if we weren't horrified and didn't have this emotional response to these things, we would allow them to happen, and it would harm our race. Our survival would not continue if we allowed such events to go on. If most of us, I guess, allowed this sort of thing to go on, which we would, I guess, if we weren't horrified by them.
Well, I mean, so that's right. That's the explanation. And it also helps to explain why, yes, we're horrified by what happened in Paris, but we can forget about it pretty easily. And I'll bet I can speak for myself, and your listeners may find this true of their own experience, that what bothers me or upsets me more is the way that one of my son's friends mistreated him on the playground the other day. That's much more on my mind than what happened in Paris. And, that's not a flattering thing or a happy thing to admit about ourselves. But Adam Smith talks about how someone would hear about an earthquake in China that killed millions, and it would upset him. But it wouldn't upset him nearly as much as it would if he were scheduled to have his pinky amputated the next day. Evolution has directed us to react most strongly to what is closest to home, and for good reason, because that is what affects us most directly.
That's a really interesting way to look at it, because, I mean, I guess I don't have a son, but if I did, and if he was on the playground being bullied or got pushed down and maybe broke his arm, I mean, I would be upset by that. At the same time, if I saw the Paris situation on the news the same day, I would be maybe more horrified in the moment. But next week, I would probably be more concerned about my son's broken arm than the events in Paris, because my son is my lineage. He is, what's going to carry on my survival of my genes. So it makes more sense, even though if you compare the events side by side, obviously my son getting pushed down and breaking his arm is nowhere near the scale of a tragedy as what happened in Paris. And yet that is what the event that's going to affect me more, because it's closer to my personal survival or the personal passing on of my genes.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, I got to commend you, Bill, because this is a book that I think will interest people from all sides of the aisle, sides of the philosophical aisles, I should say. There's definitely not just two when it comes to that. But, I know existentialism is in many ways associated with the left, with beatniks and, writing poetry on the roof and stuff like that. And free markets are largely associated with the far right. And, and you do a really excellent job of showing how if you hold these ideas or one of them, you're not really necessarily far away from, or you're not excluded from believing the other. They are things that can mix very well. So before I let you go, Bill, why don't I just give you your last pitch why anyone should check out your book if they're advocates of free markets that have no idea about existentialism, or maybe they're existentialists. They Googled existentialism and found this interview, but they're really not free market fans. So why should they take that extra step and go out and get your book?
Wow, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the whole opportunity in the interview. So the idea is that these are ideas that go together quite well: free markets and existentialism. So free markets, as you suggest, are oftentimes associated with the political right, and the political right is oftentimes associated with conservative social values and religious thinking, and that may be all well and good, but the idea is that there is a secular case to be made for free markets, and likewise, from the existentialist starting point, one does not necessarily have to drink the Kool-Aid and go down the socialist road just because one finds a secular starting point and an appeal in the existentialist philosophy of individual freedom and responsibility that can be taken beyond the metaphysical and beyond just the freedom within one's own mind, and extended into the realm of the social and the political and the economic as well. So I'd be thrilled to hear from anybody who is listening today, and thrilled to hear from anybody who reads the book. I can be found at my King's College web address and email address, which is William Irwin, IRWIN, at Kings, KINGS.edu. Always interested in hearing from new people and discussing new ideas. And thanks for being such a pro and having read my book, like I said, more carefully than I think I did, Mark. This has been a great opportunity and a fun conversation for me.
Well, thanks, Billy. I really appreciate it. Maybe it's time for you to give your book another read, huh?
That might be.
I like to know at least vaguely what I'm talking about when my guests come on the show. So reading the book is a big help with that. And I did definitely find it interesting. So, Bill, I wish you the best of luck with this book and with all of your academic and philosophical pursuits.
Keep roaring, Mark.
Thanks, Bill. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my conversation there today with Bill Irwin. As you guys may know, if you're listeners of this program, I really do enjoy getting into the weeds sometimes on the philosophy stuff, and many people might blow off philosophy as a meaningless exercise, and you'll hear things like, yeah, that philosophy stuff is great, but we need to focus on the real world. But at its core, philosophy is really just the quest for truth and knowledge about the world around us. So there's no better way to figure out what to do in the real world than by studying philosophy, than by really trying to put effort into what is right, what is wrong, what the meaning of the world is. Existentialism kind of says there is no real meaning. That's not really the direction I come at things from, but it is certainly an interesting subject and an interesting area to get into. And I was glad I was able to do that today with Mr. Irwin. Now, when it comes to natural rights, many people like Bill Irwin have reached the conclusion that there is simply no such thing, that we don't really have any sort of quote-unquote right to our body, right to property. Rather, he would argue that anything we might view as rights are simply constructs created by men out of expediency. And listeners of this show may know that I hold slightly different beliefs, and I'm not going to attempt to go into a whole spiel about that just in the closing moments of one show, but whenever we talk about this subject, I always recommend the work of a past guest on the show, Mr. Shane Whistler, who to me has made a compelling philosophical case proving the existence of natural rights, for making the assertion that individual rights are true concepts which we can indeed induce from observing the world around us. So I do want to, once again, highly recommend his book, Reason and Liberty. We will link to that in the show notes over at lionsofliberty.com/172. And of course, for a totally different perspective on rights, check out Bill Irwin's work, The Free Market Existentialist. I don't want to tell you what's right or wrong. I just want to provide you guys with some of the tools for figuring some of these things out yourselves. And if you enjoy, like I do, getting into the weeds on all this philosophical stuff, if you want to get further into this conversation about rights, well, then I invite you over to our private Facebook page, the Lions of Liberty Forum. Just type that into your search bar and it'll show up for you on Facebook, hopefully. We'll also, again, link to that in the show notes for the show. You can, of course, follow our public Facebook page, facebook.com/Lions of Liberty. Come tweet to us. Find us on Twitter at Lions of Liberty. If you enjoyed this program, please do subscribe on iTunes, on Stitcher Radio, however you listen to the show, and please do go and leave us a 5-star rating and a great free review. That stuff really helps us get this show to more people out there. You can also find us on YouTube if you prefer listening that way. You can hear us on the weekend at libertytalk.fm and throughout the week at lrn.fm, the Liberty Radio Network. This coming Wednesday, my guest will be an associate professor of political science at RIT, Lauren Hall, and we'll be discussing all sorts of things from classical liberalism to the gender wage gap. Until then, folks, live long and live free.
Head of editing and mastering is John Daubert.
Contact Johnny53 at gmail.com.